is my pleasure this morning to introduce our next speakers, Leo Farley and Virginia Peel. Mr. Farley received his master's in social work from Salem State and has been with the Department of Children and Families since 1980. During this time, he has literally helped thousands of families, and he currently serves as Director of Adoption Support Services. He has championed the quest for permanency for every child, including older youth, and has also coordinated the Breakthrough Series Collaborative on Youth Permanence. Mr. Farley has designed and run numerous trainings on the adoption process and adoption-related issues, and today he's co-presenting with Virginia Peel. Ms. Peel earned her law degree at Northeastern University and has served in various roles at DCF since 1983, including Chief Counsel, Deputy General Counsel, and now General Counsel. During this time, she has argued cases before the Appeals Court and the Supreme Judicial Court, and Ms. Peel is also involved in drafting legislative, policy, and regulatory changes. Today, Ms. Peel and Mr. Farley will be talking about practical applications of birth-family engagement in public agency adoptions. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speakers.
Well, thank you and good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. People at DCF are very pleased to be a part of this conversation and part of this meeting, and I'd like to thank Hal and the Rudd Center for creating this opportunity for all of us. I think, as Adam alluded to, it's always a positive when we can expand the conversation about adoption, and particularly the conversation about public agency adoption. So while it's daunting to follow the panel like that and to follow Adam, we're going to do our best to sort of give you a framework in which we work and help you understand how we deal with the concept of engaging birth parents in the adoption process. And for those colleagues of us who are from DCF, you may find this a little bit of nuts and bolts, but I think there's some value in going back to the basics sometimes and sort of re-examining what you do from the very beginning, so hopefully you'll bear with us. So DCF is not an adoption agency. Our primary role is to return children safely to their homes, or even better, to keep them in their homes without any kind of removal, and we are largely successful in that. But unfortunately, we cannot keep every child safely at home, and we cannot return every child from foster care to a safe and stable environment. So we are required to become an adoption agency, and we are in fact the largest adoption agency in the state. DCF sponsors, as you see, 800 adoptions every year. That's fluctuated up and down over the course of time, but that's what we're running right about now. Since 1980, there have been 24,000 individuals adopted through DCF, some of whom obviously are adults now, some are infants. And the majority of these children who are adopted through DCF come to adoption through the care and protection process, and that results in a termination of parental rights. We have very few families who come to us wishing to surrender their children. So there's a process, and that has a basis, or a bearing on how our adoption works out. So we are the agency that has, as I say, responsibility for children in foster care, and we work directly with children who cannot return home to prepare them for adoption, and we also are responsible for recruiting and seeking out families who are interested in adopting those children. So we'll do both the recruitment and the training for those individuals. We work with, right now, 11 private adoption agencies in Massachusetts with which we have contracts. And those agencies partner with us to either do individual pieces of work like child assessments or pre-adoption license studies for existing foster homes. And in some cases, they act as the department. They are the case managers who take over responsibility for the child's case once the goal is adoption, and they are responsible for following all our policies and procedures and working to find a permanent home for those children, just as our staff would. So it's a good partnership. And in addition to that, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we've been very fortunate to have had the Mass Adoption Resource Exchange as our photo listing agency for the last however many years, as long as I've been around, and certainly longer than that even. And we have been extraordinarily fortunate to have a great deal of support from Jordan's Furniture. They have been a huge supporter to us in our efforts to recruit and maintain foster homes and to spread the word about how crucial it is that we find good adoptive homes for those children who can't return home. So our staff, as I say, we're very large. We have 150 adoption staff across the state who are devoted to finding adoptive homes for children. And when I say devoted, that is truly the word. Our adoption staff are passionate about what they do. They are very committed to the work that they have chosen, and they are, by and large, a very long-lived group. They get into those positions and they stay there for many, many years, particularly adoption supervisors. So it's a great strength for the department, and it certainly serves the children with the goal of adoption extraordinarily well. As I said, we are an agency that works through the courts, and we have a great deal of contact with the families as we work through the legal process. We have 80 attorneys on staff who work on adoption issues, and those attorneys are supervised by excuse me, about 15 legal managers. There's a tremendous amount of work, I have to say, to acknowledge Virginia and her staff, that goes on in the courts, and it would seem that that work is getting more complicated as time goes on, as regulations and federal policies change. It seems that the legal piece gets more and more complicated, so we have to acknowledge the tremendous amount of work that our attorneys do in the courts, both in the care and protection side, and then when it comes time to legalize adoptions.
Just before we leave this slide, the lawyers who are in our field offices working on this, they don't work exclusively on adoptions, obviously. They are representing the agency in all of the custody cases in the agency, but all of them touch adoption. There was a period of time in our agency when we had a group of lawyers who exclusively did the termination adoption side. We found that that was not as effective in terms of the legal representation for our agency, and they all now will take a case from the beginning to end so they understand the entire process that's involved. So we want to talk about who can adopt if you are looking for children from DCF. You have to be 18, but there's no upper age limit on that. One of the legal limits, and this is in the statute in Massachusetts, is that you can adopt your sibling, your spouse, or an aunt and uncle, or anyone older than yourself. So that's just in the law in Massachusetts. You can be single, married, in a partnership. You can be straight or GLBT. You can be a homeowner. You can be a renter. You do need stable income. You don't necessarily need parenting experience. From our agency, it doesn't cost the families anything to adopt through our agency, and there are post-adoption services available.
And one thing I point out is we're one of a handful of states that will allow our employees to be visiting resources or to actually adopt children from foster care. Obviously, there are issues around the appearance of conflict of interest that we need to deal with, but we've been very successful in having a number of our employees develop relationships with children outside of their DCF professional relationship.
And this really was one where we had to develop sort of some rules and guidelines around how that happened, so we did avoid the ethical issues, and so that we have a process built in within our agency, both for our own agency staff and those who are on contract with us, to go through a process so we make sure that there's no conflict between the work that they're doing to try to reunite the family and the work the agency's doing to try to reunite the family at the same time that they may want to adopt. The other thing I think it's important to know is we don't just look for families in Massachusetts. Our adoption workers look for families all over the country, and again, good use of the internet potentially. So any country in the United States. There also is possibility of doing adoptions in another country. We don't do a lot of that work. Most of the time we can find families here in the United States to adopt our kids.
So the bottom line is mostly what we're looking for is individuals who are able to be open and to be tolerant of the needs of the family and of the children that we're looking to place for adoption. I'm sure somebody during this conversation has told you that there are about 100,000 children in foster care in this country right now. 9,051 reside in Massachusetts at this point, so we have our share. Of those, 2,290 are children with a goal of adoption, and that obviously is a cumulative thing. Most children come into adoption, into foster care, pass through and go home. Children who stay longer and can't go home end up being sort of the larger number, and they are with us for a longer period of time. Approximately 600 of those children are children who do not yet have an identified waiting family to adopt them. So those are the children that we face our biggest challenge with and we need to recruit for. So who are these children? Most of these children are in care due to abuse and neglect, and most of the cases that we deal with really are neglect. You'll hear about the cases in the paper of horrific abuse, children who are physically injured or sexually abused, but a great deal of the work that we do is around families who are just not able to provide good, solid care for their children. They're not evil, they're not ill-intentioned, they just, for whatever reason, have very great difficulties creating a safe environment for a child. Most of the children that we deal with who have a goal of adoption right now are between the ages of 6 and 12. It's about 32%. It's about 16% of these kids are over the age of 12, and we actually have 4 children on our adoption track right now who are over the age of 18. So we have a big range in terms of ages. We obviously do have younger children, but those children from the preteen years through to 18, 20 are in many ways our biggest challenge. Many of the children come from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. They can have a variety of issues, whether they be emotional, physical, medical, behavioral, or intellectual limitations, but obviously not all of them. And we have a number of sibling groups that we work very hard to keep together, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through this presentation. And given that they're older, many of these children have some connections to their birth parents or to their birth family. And one of the things that I think is a unique challenge to us is that older children can have connections well beyond their birth mother and their father or the father figure in their home. They have aunts, they have uncles, they have cousins. So to pretend that those relationships don't exist just doesn't make any sense for us. So when we talk about the birth family, we're talking about the birth family in a really large context. So some of these children are legally free, about half of them, roughly, right now in that population are legally free, which means that the other half aren't. And that can be a process that can be relatively quick. It can take as little as 6 months in some very rare cases, or it can go on for literal years in a number of cases. So that creates a situation where we have staff who are engaged with the birth parents and the child literally in some cases for years. So they need to develop relationships with those individuals. I'm going to use a family that I was involved with to illustrate some of this as we go through. And the worker for the Pea family, the worker was assigned to the family. This guy was dedicated to this family. He really thought that if he had just a little more time, if he could have a few more services, that he'd be able to return these children home safely. And he worked on that morning, noon, and night for years. He would literally go to their home on Saturdays to fix things that were broken. If the sink was plugged up, he would go. If they were having problems with money, they could call him pretty much any time, and he would try and get them to some kind of a food bank or something. And that relationship went on for years. And obviously, he had a relationship with the little girls, the children as well, and I'm going to talk more about the children later on. But in terms of talking about engaging birth families, that's kind of where we start, is the first person who has a relationship with that family carries that relationship through for a number of years. And so that comes into the conversation around what kind of connection you're going to have to these children if and when they get adopted. Okay. I mentioned older children just very quickly. I just wanted to assure you that older children do get adopted. Unfortunately, that's not great numbers, but we're very proud of the work that we have done, and these numbers are growing, and I don't think you would have seen this back in in fact, I know you wouldn't have seen this back in 1980. So since 2008, 200 children. As you can see, it drops off pretty quickly after 17. But the fact that there are 17, 18, and 22-year-old children being adopted, I think is huge progress for us, and it's something that we are dedicated to continuing. And I think this is just an area where certainly the Public Aid Child Welfare Agency has recognized that simply there tended to be a trend when a child hit a certain age that they were believed to be unadoptable. And I think that what we've been working on over the last several years, and this is reflective of that, is you don't stop trying to find that permanent family. And what we've heard from our children who are aging out of the foster care system is, just because I'm 18 doesn't mean I don't want a permanent family. And so we really had to wrestle with the sort of legal issue of,
can we sponsor these adoptions of kids over the age of 18? And we said yes, and we're actually including that as a specific statement in a new policy we're issuing this year. And I think you see that reflective here. It's acknowledging that, no, there are children over the age of 18 who want to be a permanent part of a family, and we should be able to sponsor their adoptions, and we should be able to support them in that.
So again, with a nod to our staff, it's not easy work, and they are dedicated to making this happen. I've talked to workers who have worked with older youth for literally years, and they are determined that they are going to find an adoptive home for this child someday. So it's something that's, when it happens, it's very rewarding. It just doesn't happen often enough right now. But certainly, to talk a little bit more about the older children, we believe that if we can keep them connected to their birth family, that will minimize the number of loyalty issues that they have, and that it will help them in transition to an adoptive family in a much more positive way when we reach the point where we do find an adoptive home for them. And to have their birth families engage and have them support that transition is hugely helpful when we can make that happen.
So I just wanted to talk a little bit, making sure that everybody understands sort of our legal obligations as a child welfare agency, a public child welfare agency. The first thing our obligation is obviously not to remove children from their biological families if that's possible. There's very specific state and federal requirements that we used reasonable efforts to prevent placement. Then even when the children are placed, we have those same reasonable efforts to try to reunite the families, and actually we're very, very successful with that. The majority of our children actually return home to their biological family in under 12 months. Vast, vast majority of our families. So, but that is a legal obligation of the agency. We also have a legal obligation to keep siblings together. That legal obligation was strengthened in 2008, both at the state level and at the federal level by some legislative changes. For those of you who know, at the federal level, it's called Fostering Connections. That definitely both strengthened the requirement for sibling contacts and sibling placing siblings together, but also we'll talk about later about searching for kinship. In that same year, Massachusetts did a massive overhaul of our child welfare law and also strengthened both of those areas. The requirement that you place siblings together, or if you can't, that there be visitation. I'm going to talk a little later about the specific requirements in the law for sibling visitation. And the obligation to place children with relatives. And in Massachusetts, in our agency and specifically, and Leo will talk about this, we have a very broad definition of kin and what those connections are. The state law actually specifically goes beyond simply relatives that the federal law requires and talks about other adults that the child has a connection to. So whether it's the neighbor that they're very connected to, or the teacher, or the godparent, or whoever it is, they don't have to be biologically connected to put the responsibility on the agency to look for relatives. We have revised our regulations to reflect this, and we're actually working on training now on a new policy that will reflect many of these changes, where I think the agency, certainly when I started 30 years ago, there was more unrestricted foster home and adoption, and what I've seen over that 30 years is a shift from that to more kinship, more connection with relatives, more openness, and that our policies are reflecting that work.
So let me just say that's a very positive thing, and those are the pieces that have been put into place on the legal side based on research and on good practice. But in putting that into play, it certainly can make life very complicated for a number of people. As we said, we try and keep siblings together. It's not a surprise that all siblings are not born at the same time. So we have a number of situations where siblings are born in sequence, and we have an obligation to try and keep those children together. If you're an adoptive parent who adopted 2 years ago and you thought that you were done with your family, it can be a big surprise when we call and say, well, you know, a sibling has been born to a child that you adopted. That child is in foster care. Would you consider adopting that child? That's very different than making a decision and acting on it and following through to adopt. That's sort of having it put in your face about, okay, you're going to step up, or what are you going to do? So it can be very difficult for some families, and we'll sort of see how this plays out later on when I talk a little bit more about the Pea family. But it's certainly, it's a benefit to the children, but it's, there's two sides to every coin. So I think we got a little bit forward. I'll go back a little bit. So our beliefs, I think, in addition to the legal requirement, we do believe that it's in the best interest of children being adopted to maintain both pre- and post-termination contact with their biological family, to feel that their birth family and their adoptive parents know and respect each other, and to grow up with their birth siblings and half-siblings whenever possible, and to have regular contact with their birth siblings when it's not possible to be able to be adopted into the same home. And to illustrate that, I was not involved in this, but one of our workers told me a story about a little boy who had been adopted by a same-sex couple, and they developed a good relationship with his mother, who was a drug addict, and they saw her both before and after legalization. And she continued on the path that she was on, and when it came time for them to have to tell him that she had passed away due to a drug overdose, he obviously was very upset. But one of the things he said to them was, well, I know this is really, really hard, but I know it's hard for you too, because I know you loved her. So that obviously made it easier for him in a very, very difficult situation, and that wouldn't have happened if they hadn't been able to maintain that connection. So as Virginia mentioned, we have a very, very broad definition of kin, which again has its challenges in seeking those folks out, but it extends far beyond the birth parents. Kin is those persons are related either by blood, marriage, or adoption. So adult siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, or a significant other adult to whom the child or parents ascribe the role of family based on cultural values or affectional ties or individual family values. And the parents and legal guardians of siblings are regarded as kin. So it's a really big constellation. When we have a child come into care, those are the folks that we are challenged to identify and find, and then talk to them about whether they have the interest and the ability to step up and provide first foster care. And hopefully that same conversation includes, if this child can't safely go home, would you adopt? It's, as I say, there's a number of people that we are asked to look at. The good side is that it expands the possibilities. The difficulty is that it's just a big challenge to find that number of people. Yeah. We have one situation where there were two children who came into care. They were adopted, and their mother had two other children eventually, and those children came into care. Their goal is adoption, but we have not found an adoptive family for them. They're in a residential setting, both of them. And the mother of the children who were adopted has visited them regularly. She has brought her children to see their siblings on a regular basis. She had them come to her home until that became unsafe and she wasn't able to handle them. But even when that happened, she continues to see them at the residential setting, and she's maintained those sibling connections really with very little help from us. It's a decision she made and something that she does. And that would not have happened without her stepping up to do that, because the birth family, for whatever reason, is parts unknown, and we have no contact with them, and they do nothing to try and maintain any contact between their children. So there's a way that being engaged with siblings has managed to keep those connections for those siblings who cannot safely live together. I talked a little bit about how we do that. I'm not going to go into any details, but we do make diligent efforts to find all of the family members, including the birth fathers and their families. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. But we will seek out the non-custodial parents, relatives, and kin. We use information provided by the family. And that comes in at different times. When it's foster care, you may not get as much information. When the goal changes to adoption, you may suddenly find that there are other relatives that the family wasn't willing to share with you. The game changes when the goal changes to adoption. And we also used internet-based search. As Adam pointed out, there are some very positives to that. All of our offices have a program that allows them to do searches for individuals. And as I say, we sometimes deal with families for years, so we sometimes have very extensive records on extended families in DCF, and so we ask our workers to spend the time to go through those sometimes not computerized records to find information about potential relatives and kin.
And this is sort of an interesting area just in terms of thinking about the technology and how is the agency using technology or technology that it has to assist with this. So one of the things that we did about a year ago, and people have been asking for us to do this for a long time, is we have a client-based electronic record. And they said, you know, you have to dig through pages and pages and pages and pages to find where somebody had said, you know, here's the aunt's name, here's her phone number. We actually are using technology to put that information in one place. So regardless of how many social workers or how many adoption workers there might be in a case, or what length of time, I mean, that might have been something that somebody got when the child was first came to the attention of the agency, but now it's 10 years later, trying to use technology to put that in one place so that when people are actually searching for who the fathers are, who their relatives are, who are the kin, who are the people who are important to this child, even if it's 10 years later, that we have that in one place. And it's just interesting thinking about the ways in which, even as a public agency, we're trying to think about using the technology. As Leo said, this web-based search, we actually bought a license to do this. So we had started to think about how do you use technology to find relatives and to actually use it that way. And we do it more. We do use more of our technology to find relatives, both now up front, but it really came about because we had children who were spending too much time in foster care and we were trying to get them adopted. So the impetus behind moving to the technology and web-based searches came from the adoption side of our agency.
Okay, let me just try and expand a little bit on that in two ways. One is, as I said, the game changes when the goal changes to adoption. And one of the challenges that we face is that we sometimes don't get kin identified, or we've identified kin and they did not want to be foster parents, but when the game changed and the goal is adoption, they're now faced with losing a member of their family. They now say that they would like to be considered an adoptive resource. So we will study those families, but the family that has cared for that child for 2, 3, 4 years and felt that they wanted to adopt the child is now in a very difficult position because they, in the best case, recognize that the child should be placed with family, but the loss that they're facing is pretty tremendous. And so we need to do the study on the kin that we've identified, and then we need to sit down and make a very difficult decision about what's in the best interest of that child, to stay with the family that he has been with for 1, 2, 3 years, or to take the longer view and to move the child to the kin. And in most cases, we come down on the side of the longer-term best interest, and we do make the decision the painful decision to move that child to transition to their kin. And most families step up and help with that transition. Some find it very hard, but that's one of the places where we really come to a clash of our values. We want children to be safe and stable, but we also want them to be with kin, and sometimes those two things are almost mutually exclusive. To go back to the Pea family, though, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture of this. After a couple of years, we did find the adult daughter of the father, and the father had significant mental health issues. His wife had mental health issues, and she was cognitively limited. But they were able to identify his daughter, who was doing very well. She was functioning well. She was raising 2 children by herself. And she did come, and she had visits with these 2 kids probably for a month, maybe. And then she decided that she just couldn't do it. She couldn't do it emotionally, and she didn't have the capacity to raise those children. So she made a decision that it was just too difficult to maintain a relationship with them, and she took a step back and basically disappeared. So just because you do all the things you're supposed to do and you are able to find somebody, it doesn't always work out the way that you hope it would. And you certainly have to respect her decision. If she wasn't able to do that, then she was able to recognize that and to make the decision to step back. Did we miss one?
Yeah, that's what I said then.
Okay,
benefits.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
My error.
That's okay.
So we do believe that if children stay connected, they'll have fewer attachment issues, they'll transition to adoptive homes more successfully, have fewer loyalty and identity issues as they grow older, and to have a larger support system as they age. So I wanted to use the Pea family again to talk about that. As I just heard, the family had a pretty significant history in terms of the parents. The kids were probably 2 and 3 at the time, and the little boy looked like he was functioning very well. His sister, even at a very young age, was starting to show some signs of difficulty. So when the goal changed to adoption and we started to recruit for them, A couple came forward, and they were really a great couple. They've been studied, they've been approved, and we did a disclosure with them. And they decided that they were interested in adopting the little boy, but they didn't think they could take on the challenges of the little girl. So we talked about that for a while, and we made the decision that we were not going to do that. That though we didn't have another family in focus, we were going to wait and keep these kids together and hopefully find them one adoptive home. So the family was very unhappy, to say the least. There was a lot of going back and forth about who they called and how they vented their anger, and they did not go away happy, unfortunately. So fast forward to about 2 years ago, and in my role as subsidy manager, I have the opportunity to talk to adoptive parents, and this parent called me to talk about one of her issues. And the little girl, in fact, did grow up to have a number of problems. She's in a residential setting now, and she will probably never live in the community. And her brother is doing well. He had, as much as no child has problems, he had no significant problems, and he is now in college. And so I asked her, do you think we made the right decision? And she was very clear that, in her opinion, that was the best thing to do. That even though they can't live together, the siblings have a good relationship. They are in contact with each other frequently, even though they can't live together. And he knows that when his parents become incapacitated or they pass away, that he'll be the legal guardian of his sister, and he'll be responsible for her welfare, and he's very comfortable with that. So she said she would, as much as it was difficult for her to raise this little girl, that she would have had it no other way. So it was a difficult decision in the first case, but it seems that it had worked out well, and she would, as I say, had it no other way. Okay, barriers. As I've been referencing, mental health issues are a big piece for us. A number of the families that we deal with aren't able to care for their children successfully because of mental health issues. Substance abuse is a big player. Violence, either domestic violence or violence against children. And those are things that have an impact on whether we think we can successfully have a post-adoption relationship, or what kind of post-adoption relationship the parents can have with the children and with the adoptive family. Then there's the issue of identified fathers. It's often difficult for us to know who the fathers of the children are, particularly when there are more number of children in the family. They may have different fathers. We may be able to find some of those fathers, but not all. And then the effects of past abuse by the parents on the children. For some children, that trauma is so real and those memories are so vivid and that anger is so great that they do not want to have any kind of relationship with their biological parent. So they're the deciders in that case, that they just don't want to do that. And then other children are not as eloquent about that, and they just have a great deal of difficulty tolerating the separation and the loyalty issues when they do see their biological family, and sometimes we just have to make a decision that's not in their best interest to continue that kind of relationship. So that may be a deal breaker in terms of open adoption, or at least in terms of contact. There may be cards and letters, but in terms of seeing the children, that may not be possible for those reasons.
So fast forward to today, I think one of the things that is important, having been in the agency for 30 years, when I started, there was no question that the general belief was closed adoptions. And only in rare cases were we entering into any agreement for some openness, and even then it was generally only letters or pictures, maybe. And at that point in time, because this was back in the 80s, there was no law for open adoption agreements. That came later on in terms of an actual statutory amendment here in Massachusetts, and what the requirements are and how to protect everybody's rights and make sure it's enforceable. And so there was, I know one of the earlier presenters was, were these agreements ever enforceable? And certainly during my first 10 years in the agency, I always wondered. We didn't know. There was one case. It was a very old case from, I think, the 70s, where somebody had sort of raised that question. It seemed like they might be enforceable. There was never a question or an answer about whether or not it could potentially undo, like if you didn't comply with the agreement you had entered into, would it undo the adoption? All of those questions, certainly when I started, were there. Also, there was not the emphasis on finding relatives and finding kin and keeping the connection with the biological family. So now, as we've said in this presentation, fast forward, we're in a very different world now. The agency's belief is, connection to family is important, that it should be maintained to the biological family, to the siblings in particular. I can't tell you the number of kids that I hear who have been separated from each other by foster care, and they're very unhappy, and they want to know how they can reconnect. And obviously Facebook has helped for some of them to do that, to actually reconnect with their siblings. So now in our public agency, it's not uncommon to facilitate an open adoption. Now again, for safety reasons, it still may only be a letter or picture, but in a lot of other cases, it's visitation. Actual visitation between biological parents and children after adoption. Also, the law has changed just in terms of the case law. So DCF itself brought a case that resulted in a decision called Adoption of Veto that really tried to put before the Supreme Judicial Court what is the authority of a judge hearing a termination of parental rights case to order post-adoption contact over the objection of the agency who's sponsoring it, of the adoptive family. I think Veto was a very thoughtful decision by the SJC, because basically what they said, and I think that this was a belief of the Chief Justice, as you saw a series of her decisions, who was Chief Justice at the time, which was Chief Justice Marshall, which was she always kept the kids in the middle, in the focus. And so for her, the question was not the rights of the biological parent or the rights of the adoptive parent. For her, the question was about the child and the child's relationship to their biological parent. And so I think she tried to find the balance between the constitutional rights of the new family, the adoptive family, and really the rights of the child to maintain that connection. And so where the court came out on that was that there needs to be a significant bond such that the disruption of that bond will harm the child. So again, the focus, and that's been continuing over time, the focus is really on the kids. And so I think over time, Massachusetts now enters often into open adoption agreements, and we have a statute that, that governs that. The other is it is a way to settle cases. I mean, when it's clear that the biological family is really not going to be able to care for the child in the long run, there's something about having the ability to have these open adoption agreements that helps with the settlement of those termination cases that can otherwise be very, very lengthy, and particularly with appeals. Also, what we're seeing now is open adoption agreements that include the visitation with siblings, grandparents, and other individuals in the family. Now, the open adoption statute itself only talks about contact with the biological parent, but I'm going to talk about this next. There's a sibling visitation statute. And so in Massachusetts, and this I think went into effect sometime in the 90s, but was strengthened in 2008, it actually requires the department or the court to provide for sibling visitation if it's in the best interest of the child, and you have to actually look at both children when you're doing that analysis. But the statute also will allow courts to order post-adoption visits between siblings. There's actually a specific piece of the statute that says for children 12 and older that they can come in and petition for sibling visitation if they are separated by foster care and adoption. And that particular provision of the law is not specific to the child welfare agencies. When you actually look at this statute, which is Chapter 119, Section 26B, it was fashioned mostly around children being in state custody, being in foster care, but not all of it. And so this particular provision for children 12 and over could apply to any adoption. Now, it wouldn't impact anybody who had been adopted prior to the implementation of that law, which was back sometime in the mid-90s. But most of the children now being adopted, they have this right if they wanted to enforce it to come and get a sibling visitation. The other thing that we have seen over time, certainly since the implementation of this and through some other case law, is that more and more judges are looking at this as an issue. I can't tell you the number of cases that we deal with on appeal after a termination of parental rights decision where the children themselves are raising the issue about the fact that the judge didn't order some type of post-adoption sibling visitation. The parents are generally raising the issue about whether or not the court should have or did order post-adoption visitation. But we had an interesting decision last year called Ileana. And in it, what we tried to advance was, because we were getting increasingly concerned that the judges were ordering more visitation, particularly parental visitation, that was realistic or could survive over time. When you start thinking about how adoptive families with their children, how their lives go, and when kids are involved in sports and things like that. And so what we tried to advance, and actually it was successful, was to say, you know, if you already have an adoptive family who's going to do what they should for their kid in terms of the best interest of the child, and they're saying to you, I believe in openness, I believe there needs to be connection, then why do you need an order? Why does it need to be enforceable? And actually the SJC agreed. They thought in finding the balance between the biological family and the adoptive family, that you don't want the courts to intrude over a long period of time in that relationship if that relationship can sustain itself over time, and that the adoptive parents are acting in the best interest of the child and allowing the post-adoption contact. The other issue I would say, when I think about what's happening today, that we don't have all the answers to yet, but it is a new issue that is arising nationally in the last at least 5 or 6 years, which is contact back with biological parents both after termination of parental rights and after adoption. I think that, not that it is, happens a lot, but it's also not rare that children will be brought back into the foster care system after having been adopted through our system. And that sometimes adoptive families no longer want contact with that child. And what our agency is doing and struggling with is, so how do we reconnect back with the biological families? Because you know what? Sometimes 10 years later, 15 years later, the biological family and where they are and their ability to care for their children is very different. And so this is definitely a new and novel issue across the country in public child welfare agencies. This discussion is going on because the laws don't support it. I mean, so the practice is getting ahead of the laws because there are no laws to reinstate parental rights in Massachusetts. And what if ultimately we want to reconnect them back, we actually have the biological family re-adopt their children, which seems very strange, I have to say, to biological families, that they have to re-adopt their children. But that's one of the legal mechanisms we're using, if not guardianship, to facilitate them basically reinstating their parental rights to make decisions for their biological children. Do we do the sibling? We did the sibling visitation.
Yeah, we did the siblings.
Yep. So I just wanted to talk a little bit just about the open adoption agreements. For those of you who don't know, there are very specific requirements. It's in Chapter 210, Section 6D is the specific requirements. So what's important is that when the law was passed, it's very clear that a breach of the agreement does not undo the adoption. That was certainly very, very important, I think, for adoptive families to have that in the law. It basically survives as an independent contract and becomes enforceable like an independent contract. So it does have to be, I'll go on to that. And you don't have to disclose necessarily the identity of the adoptive family. So remember, this law, I think, was in the 90s when it was passed. There was still a lot of concern about that. And I think there still are some cases where there's a safety issue and the identity of the adoptive family is not known for safety reasons with the biological family, but there can be some context. So if the adoptive family does not want their identity known, then there has to be an agent here in Massachusetts for legal for basically legal service, legal notice. So in the event that there is a breach of the agreement, the biological family would be able to come in and get an enforcement of the agreement. The other thing I'm not sure everybody knows is the agreement actually ends on the child's 18th birthday. The idea is that once a child is 18, they're an adult and they can make decisions about what contact that they have.